recent policy decisions are affecting the competitive landscape. Today, we're going to swerve in a slightly different direction and focus more on the strategy side of the discussion, an equally exciting area that's really seen explosive growth in recent years. As organizations face unique problems as a result of the tech boom, it's important that our business and legal advisors have a firm understanding of what they're dealing with and how to help provide leadership on those issues. So specifically, this session will focus on digital marketplace strategies and challenges for the future. And so we're very fortunate to be joined by Andrei Hagiu of Boston University's Questrom School of Business. Andrei is an associate professor of information systems at Boston University's Questrom School of Business, as I mentioned. And previously, he was an associate professor in the strategy group at Harvard Business School and in the technological innovation, entrepreneurship, and strategic management at MIT Sloan. Andrei also holds a PhD in economics from Princeton University. Andrei's research and teachings are entirely focused on platform businesses. And so this is Airbnb, Alibaba, Amazon, Google, Grab, Facebook, PlayStation, Apple, and those unique startup challenges as a result of it. He leverages the insights from his research to advise and angel invest in startups attempting to build platforms and marketplaces, and to consult with large companies seeking to turn their products into platforms. So Andrei, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I'll give you a chance to introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me. Pleasure to be here. I think that was a great introduction. I don't know if I have anything to add.
Great. Well, to all of our listeners today, thank you very much for being here. And I'll let you know that you're free to submit questions, and I will stop a couple of times during the discussion to pose those questions to Andrei, and we'll have a little bit of time at the end for some interactive discussion as well. So to start off, Andrei, it might be helpful to start with a bit of background on digital marketplaces. You've written a lot about roll-ups lately, and for those like myself who aren't aware of them, can you give us a bit of background on what those are in the context of digital marketplaces and who the key players involved might be?
Sure. So this is it is true. It's a relatively recent phenomenon. I think we're talking about 4 or 5 years maybe or so. The way to think about it, so think about a marketplace, a big marketplace like Amazon. Most sellers on Amazon are very small, like they're very tiny, right? I mean, and a lot of them so some of them are not very good, but some actually are pretty creative, right? So maybe they'll come up with an interesting new sock or whatever, like some kitchen appliance, like some interesting take on a new kitchen appliance. And it's really good. It's very creative. People like it. They start like seeing a lot of sales. The problem is like they're not really professional, right? I mean, they don't really know they're good like at small scale, but when it comes to like really scaling up, they don't really know what they're doing. And this created an opportunity for something that a lot of people are calling marketplace aggregators. So these are companies that basically essentially it's an arbitrage opportunity, right? So they look at this and say, listen, there's all these small sellers and some of them are just very innovative, but they're subscale. Wouldn't it be good if we just aggregate them? So aggregating means we'll acquire, like more, think of them as acquiring. Like the contractual arrangements vary, but it's pretty much like an acquisition. So we pay them, decent sum of money. They have to stay involved. But essentially, we're acquiring them. And then that's what the roll-up means. We're acquiring a large number of these small sellers. And then the aggregator, what they bring to the table is basically, well, they have a lot more capital, so they can deploy, they can really like scale up these products that are showing promise. They're also very good at understanding how to sell stuff on a marketplace. I mean, this is the other part that's important to understand here. So Amazon, it's a big marketplace. There's a lot of rules. There's a lot of, let's call it quote unquote tricks for how to sell efficiently on Amazon. You have to know how to price, when to offer discounts, how to present the product. Basically, like, because there's so many sellers, you can get drowned. So you have to sort of understand how the Amazon algorithm works in order to, not to game it, but to basically take full advantage in order to get your product to be seen. Again, if you're a small seller, you're probably not very good at this. Versus these aggregators, because they have more capital, and because they're doing it for many sellers, there's economies of scope, right? So they get very good at this. They can cross-sell, they can cross-advertise these various products. So I think that's basically, that's the background. So there's a number of these. So just to give you a sense, there's a number of companies, to their credit, saw this as a massive arbitrage opportunity. And I think the most famous one is a company called Thrasio. which was, I think, the first one to basically do this at scale on Amazon. Thrasio, if I'm not mistaken, it's the fastest, something like the fastest company in history to go from 0 to $1 billion in revenue, like literally. So it's like, and obviously they raised a lot of capital, but just because, just acquiring a lot of products and then just scaling up those products. So they did this like within 2 years. It was founded in 2018. And then I think by 2020, they were worth over $1 billion, and they're worth a lot more than that now. And there's a number of others. And this happens again. So this happens on Amazon. There's a number of companies that are doing exactly this on Amazon. It's happening on Alibaba. It's happening on eBay. It's now happening on Shopify as well. So like any big marketplace that you can think of, there are companies that are raising money and saying, we'll just aggregate small players and, try to scale them up.
That's really interesting. And we've got a lot of lawyers on the call right now, I'm sure. And these are people that are going to be advising companies both on the aggregator side and on the merchants who are being commoditized. And so you're an expert on strategies. And I'm wondering, what are the challenges and risks that these merchants are facing? If I'm working with them, what do I need to know if they're being commoditized?
Right. So this is a sort of taking a step back a little bit. So I think there's two parts of this, right? I mean, I'm sure I'm not a lawyer, but I'm certain that the lawyers in the audience will see plenty of opportunities to work with the aggregators for sure. I mean, I think there's probably some interesting contractual arrangements, in how exactly you acquire these small sellers. They're usually not acquired up front. There's some revenue sharing, so there's probably some interesting stuff in there. The question about commoditization of sellers, I would put that it's a little bit different, but they're related. So the point of if you're a seller, right? Let's say I'm a seller on Amazon. Well, the great thing about being on Amazon, obviously, is that it gives me access to millions of customers, which otherwise it would be very difficult to reach. Like there's no what are my options? I mean, I could try to sell on my own website, but I mean, no one knows my website, right? And it's very difficult to advertise. Whereas I put it on Amazon, if the product's decent, I mean, I just get instant access to tens of millions of customers. It's great. Now there's a downside. And I think this is the part everyone's going to become increasingly aware of the downsides of being on large marketplaces. And broadly speaking, you can think of it as commoditization. If you're a seller on a large marketplace, well, what does the marketplace do? It gives you lots of customers, but it also, unfortunately, you're not the only seller. And so their interest is, I'm going to bring as many sellers as possible. So I will commoditize you that way. I would definitely bring a lot of competitors because, well, they want to give people consumers a lot of options. So that's not great for each individual seller because you're competing with a lot of others. Not only are you competing with lots of sellers, they will also obviously over time, as Amazon, I don't want to pick on Amazon. I think Amazon's, what they're doing is great. So overall, I think sellers benefit from it, but certainly there are some practices that they're probably not entirely happy with. So for example, over time, Amazon presumably started increasing their fees, right? I mean, initially, probably they had lower fees. As they became more dominant, they can start extracting more money. Now, that doesn't have to be done directly. Yesterday I was charging you $10 a month. Starting next month, I'll charge you $20. I think they're usually a little bit more subtle than that. And one way in which this happens is up to now, you just basically let's say you pay a monthly subscription to be placed on Amazon. But recently what Amazon did, they introduced, so what was it called, sponsored placement. They used to not have sponsored placement, right? You basically search for a product on Amazon, and the only thing you would get is organic search result, which from a buyer perspective, that's better, right? But I'm sure everyone has noticed this. Now it's the first thing, they're sponsored links. Why do they do this? Well, it's because it's another way to extract more money from the sellers, right? It's if you're a seller, you have the option, but can you really afford not to pay for advertising if your competitors are paying for it, right? So the point is once they introduce the ability to pay for advertising, well, every seller feels if I'm not paying my competitors, well, so we need to compete on that. They can raise prices. Oh, and also another way in which they commoditize sellers, obviously, is Amazon can copy and produce their own. They don't do this as much as people assume, but for some products, certainly they offer their own competing version. And they can also self-preference, so they can put their version at the top, so people see that more often than they see the sellers. So bottom line, there's different ways in which if I'm a seller in the marketplace, I mean, this is the natural tendency. I will be commoditized, right? But fundamentally, it's because, well, the marketplace is the one bringing the customers to me. Well, they kind of own the customers, like because they're they're kind of in charge of the customers. So in some sense, it's good, but it's also like I don't have a very strong identity. I'm one of many different sellers on Amazon. People kind of know Amazon's brand, but they don't really know my brand, right? And I think what you refer, so I've written about, there's multiple strategies. If you're a seller, there's some, I mean, some of the stuff, there's not much you can do about it, but certainly I think there's some tactics now that sellers can use to at least try to escape a little bit this tendency towards commoditization.
And yeah, do you want to speak a little bit more to those strategies?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think these are useful to keep in mind. So I would say, so there's a few things, right? The first one, the first and most basic one, I think no matter how small, no matter like, so I'm using Amazon as an example, but I would say, okay, just have, let's say Amazon small sellers, it's DoorDash and restaurants or whatever, like food delivery service and restaurants. So this applies to all these platforms and the participants, the sellers on the platform. So it could be any of these. Well, the first thing, they should have a direct channel. I think at this point, so maybe initially early days of the internet, you could say, well, if I'm a small restaurant, like having a website is complicated. It's not complicated today. There's a millions, like including, like actually you guys based in Toronto, so Shopify, right? I mean, that's what Shopify does, right? It makes it very easy for anyone and their grandmother to put up an e-commerce website. Now, it doesn't guarantee that anyone's going to come to your website. So that's, that's still a problem. But I think having a direct presence and a brand online is important. So that's the first step, because it's very cheap. There's lots of different companies that offer this. So I think it's important to have that direct presence. Now, you can't just have the direct presence, just have it sit there. I think the key is basically, certainly you should use the platform because that's where the customers are, but to the extent possible, the way I think about it is like, try to use the platform as a funnel to get new customers, and then try to redirect them to your own website, right? So like the way sellers do this or restaurants do this would be like, okay, so I am a buyer, I buy something from you on Amazon, you put a note in the package that said, if you like this product and you want to order more, like you should come check out the whole catalog at my direct website, because I have a lot more stuff on my direct website than I have on Amazon. And by the way, maybe I'll give you a discount or something like that. By the way, I think Amazon polices this to a certain extent, obviously, because they don't want people they don't want sellers like siphoning away customers. But yeah, this is like a game of cat and mouse that you should be, like, if you're a seller, you should be engaging in that. So yeah, I think so. Having a direct presence, trying to funnel customers towards your direct channel, and essentially, yeah, having some reason, like basically having some reason for people to come and look at your direct website, as opposed to like, oh, this is just a seller on Amazon, right? So I mean, maybe offering certain products or certain services in your direct channel that you don't offer on the site. Incidentally, this reminded me, a good example of this is, so think of booking.com or Expedia and hotels. So this is like, there's been this tug of war for years now, where basically like hotels, they need, it's love-hate relationships. So like they need Expedia, they need Priceline because whatever, booking.com, because well, a lot of customers book through there, but they absolutely hate them because they charge outrageous prices, right? So what the hotels are trying to do is basically get customers to try to book directly. And of course, Expedia is trying to fight against that, say like, if you get people to book directly, we're going to delist you or something like that. And then hotels try to get around it by saying, oh, if you book on our website, you can choose your room, or we'll give you complimentary breakfast or shit like that. So, I mean, it's basically the same idea for all these platforms. I mean, I think it's, yeah, at this point, I think people kind of understand this, and you have to play this game where like you're using the platform, but you're also kind of trying to channel people towards your own direct channel.
It's really interesting. You've mentioned the tug of war and kind of how each side is fighting back the aggregators and the merchants on there. So who's benefiting or losing from this whole idea of roll-ups and aggregation?
Right. So yeah, sorry, back to the originally scheduled program, right? Back to aggregators. So I think, okay, so the commoditization, I think this affects all sellers. I think it's interesting to think about aggregators in this context, because obviously what aggregators do, essentially, like if you're a small seller, yes, you will be drawn by competition. So that's another argument that you should be selling to one of these aggregators. Like, do you really want, like, you may get lucky with one product. So like maybe this month, okay, people, for whatever reason, people love your product, but do you really think you can sustain this given that there's a million other sellers on Amazon or whatever, like the relevant platform is, and they can copy you? Probably not. So as a result, it does. So this is another reason why selling to an aggregator makes sense, because the aggregators are larger. I think they understand how to build, more sustainable business or more sustainable brand and be less likely to be completely commoditized by the underlying platform, right? I mean, they have scale, they're more likely to be able to stay at the top. So yeah, so who benefits from aggregators? Certainly, I would say the small sellers. I mean, think about it. These are people who are just like, again, this is not they're not like a lot of them are not, I mean, I guess they say not professionals. I mean, they love what they're doing, but they're not very good at scaling the businesses, right? So, and for some of them, basically they get bought out for significant sums of money. Like Trust will sometimes pay like millions of dollars. So you can go do something else, right? I mean, they just take a few $1 million and that's it. And then Trust you essentially takes the business and scales it. So the small sellers are certainly benefiting from it. Well, obviously there's an arbitrage opportunity, so the roll-up, the aggregators are benefiting, although I think the aggregator game has become pretty competitive. There's a lot of companies now that are playing this aggregator game, and it's not, I think the sort of the arbitrage opportunity that I was talking about earlier, it might get competed away. Like, these are companies that just raise a lot of money, and the theory is like, I bring to bear economies of scale and economies of scope. By now, people understand this, so I think some of the arbitrage is competed away. But there's still quite a few of them, and they're very good at it. The interesting question is, like, let's say if you're Amazon, are you happy? Are you okay with allowing these aggregators? And I would say, by and large, yeah. The answer is absolutely, because what's the effect? Like if I'm Amazon, if I look at the aggregators, what's the overall effect on my marketplace? Essentially, they're just making sellers more professional. Like you might have like small sellers, this would be like, think about Airbnb as well, right? I mean, these are small individuals, like, I mean, it's great, it's very like, it's interesting, but like sometimes they don't really know what they're doing, right? It's like the quality varies. Maybe the experience they offer is not always, is not always constant or reliable. Versus if you get an aggregator, the whole point is like, we're going to professionalize this, right? I mean, we're going to make faster shipping, whatever service or quality guarantees and so on. So from the perspective of Amazon, I think it's just basically, yeah, it makes certain products more reliable, and overall they benefit as well.
It sounds like almost everybody wins. Like, does the end client end up winning in this? If the merchants are being commoditized and the aggregators are buying everyone up and the platform's happy, what happens to the end consumer?
Right. So this, I mean, to be honest, like, I don't know, someone should, so this is a good topic for an empirical economist to see like what happens to the prices on the platform, right? It's a good question. Like, because you might think if the aggregators are really good, part of it might be like, they can raise prices, or they understand when to raise, like, yeah. So I don't know. I could see it both ways, right? Maybe the aggregate. So on the one hand, they have economies of scale and scope, so they can, maybe their cost structure is lower, so that could push prices to be lower. But at the same time, because they understand, let's say, how the recommendation algorithm works better, they can fine tune their pricing a little bit better. Maybe they can extract higher prices from consumers. So I could see it. It's a good question. So I could see it going both ways. I don't know. This would be like, it's an empirical question. Like someone should do a study and say, okay, what's the effect? Like you could look at a product vertical, let's say, where an aggregator has acquired a number of sellers, and then see, okay, what happened to prices? Have they on this marketplace, have they increased or decreased as a result of the aggregators?
Interesting. And are you noticing that certain companies or industries are more apt to be involved with these aggregators? Like, are there particular areas where these companies are grouping?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a reason I keep using the Amazon example, because it started there. And I think it seemed, I mean, yeah, I think it seems pretty natural, right? That you would start with e-commerce. But again, I really think this idea. So we wrote about this, and my co-author and I wrote this in our Substack newsletter. I think what's interesting is there's no reason you shouldn't be able to apply the aggregator strategy more broadly. So it started with e-commerce, so Amazon, eBay, Alibaba. There's all the large e-commerce platforms. Definitely. So okay, so some interesting opportunities. So the other one that it expanded to is Shopify. So it's interesting because Shopify is not exactly a marketplace, right? It's actually the whole point of Shopify is that they're not like Amazon, right? If I'm a seller, it's like Shopify tells you, you should come to us so we can build your own online presence. We will never take control of your customers like Amazon does. So that there's a fundamental difference, right? Like they don't, you and I don't go to Shopify.com and look for merchants, right? Like this is basically the merchants are on their own, they control their brand. But there's now, so what's interesting is that there's some aggregators, I forget the name, there's definitely one, actually I can probably, because I have this open in front of me. There's one that's doing pretty well. It's called Open Store. Actually, I have a friend who interviewed there. So Open Store is an aggregator of Shopify merchants. It's the same idea. It's basically like all these merchants, okay, they're building websites. It's like, well, that's great. You have a website, but you don't really know, like it's hard to market your stuff online, right? Like it's hard to market on Amazon, probably even harder to market on the internet, like just generally your own website on the internet, right? So the same idea. So there's aggregators that do that. I think it's also interesting to consider aggregators beyond products. So think about, for example, content creators. Could be on YouTube, it could be on Substack, it could be on any number of these, right? Like at this point, we know that many content creators are kind of struggling. I mean, maybe they have some niche audience, they figured out like a really cool type of content that kind of works, and they built a niche audience, but they don't really know how to scale it up. And certainly there are companies, actually there's one that I know that we angel invested in 2 or 3 years ago. And essentially what they do is like they roll up popular YouTube channels, mostly focused on sports. So for example, I'm into basketball and they have a lot of like cool YouTube channels that focus on basketball. And these used to be independent channels that are doing okay, but the point is like this company is like, we're going to roll them up and essentially like cross-sell these channels and increase the audience of each individual channel. And then we can presumably sell more advertising, become more efficient and so on. So in principle, there's no reason you shouldn't be able to do this with content. On YouTube, you could also do it on something, for example, like Substack. There are all these different, like everyone and their grandmother now has a Substack newsletter. This is thing like every journalist is like, yeah, great, you work for the New York Times, but everyone should have a Substack. Well, at some point, it's like there's a million of Substacks. Like some of them are interesting, but they're kind of subscale, right? Each of them has like, I don't know, like 500 readers. It's not enough to make a living. So presumably there's an opportunity there to kind of aggregate a lot of these, essentially creating almost like mini newspapers or something, like mini New York Times. Like you can bundle them together, create subscriptions. So there's lots of interesting opportunities to do the same roll up in other, so more like content focused platforms.
And like, I hate to ask you, because anytime I ask somebody to gaze into the crystal ball, it's putting them on the spot. But you've mentioned the content creation, and you've mentioned a little bit about journalism and obviously e-commerce. If you had to make one prediction as to kind of what the next big industry is to be hit with like multiple aggregators, what do you think it would be?
Certain content for sure. So so I thought about this, but I think we wrote in our Substack newsletter. I mean, we could definitely see that. So it could, so it'd be like to some degree, by the way, Spotify is doing this. And this is basically by acquiring podcasts. I mean, everyone knows that Spotify acquired Joe Rogan, but that's like, okay, Joe Rogan could do easily very well on its own. Like that's not the right example. The right example is like they acquire a lot of smaller podcasts, and they can do that, right? So I'm sure, like I think there's an opportunity, and there's a lot of others that they haven't acquired where they're independent. I think there's an opportunity there for someone to say, listen, I'm just going to create a brand. I mean, at this point, just acquiring or whatever, like bringing together multiple podcasts where I could do this for YouTube channels or Substack newsletters or whatever have you. Or maybe it's something like it has both podcasts and newsletters. So I think it would be like, for me, that's the next one that I think will be quite interesting, is essentially around content. And then you can play around. I think the interesting thing there is like, okay, for product is basically, well, just the price of the product, right? With stocks, it's just I'm going to pay a price. But with content, what's interesting is you can play around with the business model quite a bit once you're an aggregator. If you just have like one channel, like your own, you're more limited. But if I'm an aggregator, then I can, I can sell bundles, I can sell subscription or advertising. There's multiple ways in which I could do it. It opens up like interesting possibilities in terms of the business model.
And are there economic factors to consider before engaging with the aggregators, like, in the content industry, in the journalism industry? Like, what are the economic factors that are kind of like pushing the decision-making and the business models?
Do you mean, so from whose perspective do you mean?
It could be either, but like from the aggregators, like what are the economic factors that are helping them decide like this is where I want to go?
So again, for aggregators, I mean, simplest way to think about it for aggregators is there an arbitrage opportunity? And so, I think it's useful to think about like what will be the arbitrage opportunity with content? I mean, it's a bit similar. It's like niche, could be newsletter, could be YouTube channel that has like very loyal following, so clearly engaged, but maybe hasn't reached like a lot of scale because they don't know how to reach large scale, right? So there should be some arbitrage. I mean, the whole point of the aggregator is like I acquire it, but then I can make it larger, so I can I buy it cheap and whatever, then I sell it high. So the arbitrage probably comes from that you can bring to bear some savvy in terms of like marketing or cross-selling different types of content or something like that. So I think that's kind of fundamentally that's where the economics come from. It's economies of scale, economies of scope. Again, playing around the business model. Maybe okay, so there are these like 3 different YouTube channels. They're kind of struggling. They're basically trying to sell advertising, but they're not large enough. But now, if I acquire them, now I am large enough, I have big enough audience, now I can sell ads. Like now this is an interesting target audience for like a serious advertiser to pay for. So I think that's what the economic considerations are for the aggregators. For the creators, I mean, it should be pretty obvious, right? I mean, like usually it's pretty hard. I mean, they're probably struggling. Like say the platforms take a big cut, and in a lot of cases, it's just very difficult. I mean, there's this idea is like, I can charge like $5 for a Substack newsletter. Yeah, sure. The problem is like, there are many people, each of them trying to charge $5. Like, and it's quite difficult, right? So getting an aggregator, so that's why aggregators are have been pretty successful. We say, listen, we'll just pay you like whatever, like 200K or something like that, some advance, or in some cases buy you out, or there's some interesting contractual rate. It's almost like basically like modern day publishers, right? It's like, okay, I'll just pay you something to pay your bills to motivate that, but still maintain the motivation for you to produce good content, and then I'll take care of marketing it and so on.
That's really cool stuff on the strategy side. I'm interested in getting your thoughts on what the future looks like. And if, not necessarily predictions, but just kind of giving us a sense of how things are going to develop in the digital marketplace area. And so what does the future of digital marketplaces look like? Are we going to see just, more aggregators consistently popping up until that they're commanding the market? Are we going to see a shift back towards more merchants looking to regain some control? What's the kind of scope of the future look like in the next 5 years?
I mean, yeah, don't hold me to this kind of predictions. I mean, it's very difficult, but I think broadly speaking, a lot of other people have written about this, is this idea that, okay, so initially you had, I don't know, with television or something like that, there's, just individual channels. Then like cable came around and say, wait a second, we can just put these channels together. So we create the cable bundle. So we sell this like big bundle, it has like, I don't know, 500 channels. And then people like, I don't know, like after a while, technology evolved and now everyone's against cable. It's like, and there's this tendency toward disaggregation, right? It's like, let 1,000 flowers bloom. So more broadly now, for example, every merchant can have their own online presence. They can sell directly. Every content creator can have their own channel. It's true, but it doesn't mean that all of these are viable, right? So like, I think the rise of the aggregators is showing that some amount of aggregation and bundling is actually efficient, right? So it's like almost like we're going back and forth, like fragmentations, like individual merchants, whatever, like independent creators, awesome. The problem is like to make money independently, it's quite hard. Like people are kind of finding this out. So now it's like it's going to probably swinging back a little bit the other way. And say, okay, well, there's probably some scope for aggregation slash bundling, or however you want to call it. Yeah, rebundling, right? But maybe we're not going to create a whole cable bundle, because obviously that's just too large and it's like one size fits all. You can create mini bundles. So I think now we're in a period where we're gonna. So we've had the period where this where everyone thought, say, this is going to be explosion of like millions of independent merchants and restaurants and things like that. And I think we kind of figured out, like, well, a lot of them actually are not viable on their own. So now we're basically in the period in which we're going back the other direction, like some bundling, some aggregation. But I don't think it's going to go. I definitely don't think it's going to go all the way back. I think we're going to have, it's almost like many different mini channels. And in parallel, there's always going to be, I think that's the whole point. So there's always going to be new independent merchants or sellers or creators coming up. And the ones who are really, like, some of them basically they may be just good and they can succeed independently. That's awesome. Like, but those are pretty few of them. The other ones would be like, okay, they come up with something interesting. They realize I just don't know how to make this scale. And then you basically have the aggregator option, which I think is great. It's almost like startups, right? I mean, if you're a startup, out of, let's say, 100 startups, a lot of them fail. There's just terrible idea or bad execution. Then out of the ones who have legs and make it past product market fit, some of them, they're doing well, but they're just like, they're not going to be able to scale on their own. And then they basically have to be acquired. And there's very, very few startups. I don't know, out of 100, maybe there's one or two who actually make it all the way to IPO, like, which are like standalone, they can live on their own. It's a bit the same with merchants that decide whether or not to be aggregated.
And I'm curious, how much has the pandemic played into the role of aggregators in the digital marketplace and the specialization? Is it, the aggregators and the merchants are realizing that the pandemic has changed the way of life for them and they need to adapt? Or was this kind of thing going to happen anyway?
So that's a good question. I don't think the aggregation phenomenon, I think the aggregation phenomenon is a bit, I don't know, I'm not sure the pandemic has much of an effect. I mean, I think that's sort of like it's called a secular trend that is, I don't think it's much effective. Of course, the problem, like the pandemic has had massive effect. Pandemic and the end of the pandemic that had massive effect on the underlying platforms. So say Shopify, like I'm sure some of you follow. I mean, Shopify rose tremendously during the pandemic, and then, well, its stock price and market capitalization basically lost 80 to 85% over the past 6 months. So yeah, I mean, it definitely had an effect on the underlying platforms. On aggregation, I think aggregation is definitely here to stay. I mean, the logic of aggregation, I don't think it's very, I mean, of course, they're subjected to the natural way, like if the marketplace is not doing well, then the sellers are not doing well, and the aggregators are not doing well, but that's not like, that's like a secular trend. Aggregation itself, I think, is basically, yeah, we're definitely in a period in which there's going to be more and more aggregators going forward.
And so I'm also curious about your thinking on the future, like, what are the alternatives to digital platforms and online marketplaces? If you're, well, I guess not so much an aggregator, but if you're a merchant out there and you're trying to avoid all of this from happening, what strategies do you have?
I mean, it's unclear to me that you want to, like, I think we talked a bit about this earlier. So the simple answer is the alternative is you can sell independently. Good luck. I mean, so for some merchants, and merchants could be literally like a e-commerce company. It could be a restaurant, whatever. Like some of them, great. Like they can do it. It works, and they're very good at marketing. They have the capital. That's awesome. But for a lot of them, honestly, to me, it's like, I think they should be happy that aggregators exist, because basically what this does is like, it gives them another sort of like an exit option. It just says, listen, all you have to do is like, if you come up with a product that's really good, people like enough people like, shows promise, someone will take you off your hands. Like you don't have to take it from idea to say IPO. That's hard. Like that's really, really hard. You may just be very creative, very good at coming up with the initial product idea, but it's a very different skill set to take it from there and like scaling it up, building up supply chain and stuff like that. You may not have the resources. So I think it's awesome. Again, it's a bit like startups. It just gives you another exit opportunity.
Well, thank you, Andre. So I'd like to take this opportunity to remind everybody, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A and I can ask them to Andre right now. But Andre, I'm also curious, for our business advisors and the legal advisors out there that are going to be in situations where they're working with companies going through this type of thing. Do you have any advice for them on how to guide their clients through it?
What do you mean? Like, what kind of, who would be the clients?
So like, let's say your client is a merchant that's about to get rolled up and
Right.
I'm a business advisor or a legal advisor. Like, what key things do I need to make sure that my client understands as they're going through that process?
This is the part, like, this is not my expertise at all, but honestly, this is presumed, to me, this is no different than, yeah, you're essentially, it's like you're selling your company, right? It's a little more complicated because you're not fully selling the company, you're selling the product, and there's some interesting contractual clauses. I'm certain if the audience is what I think it is, they know a lot, they understand this a lot better. Like, what you should be looking for, obviously, you want to maximize the payoff, like, you know, if the client is the merchant. But again, I'm sure the audience has a lot of ideas for how to do that. I don't think there's anything like, I would say, conceptually very complicated with that. Like, once you start thinking, okay, what does it take? I mean, we understand what the phenomenon is, and I think there are going to be some interesting opportunities there for sure. There's probably some interesting types of contracts that are being written between the merchants and the aggregators, and can't be full sale because obviously you want to keep the merchant a little bit involved, at least for a certain period, to figure out what the secret sauce of the product is. But ultimately, kind of like the aggregators probably want to take full control. So just understanding a little bit like what the priorities are.
Well, I appreciate that. I know I've kind of put you on the spot in an area that isn't your favorite one, but thank you very much. And just one last question on my part before we wrap up. I'm still, if there's any questions that come in the chat, I'm happy to ask them. But we've talked a lot about aggregation and digital marketplaces, and is there one trend that we should be aware of that could be coming in the future, similar to how these aggregators are really taking off? Is there anything else that you're seeing in your research and the writings that you've done?
Sure, like whatever, blockchain and decentralized platforms is a very different topic, but I mean, obviously, like if you expand to digital marketplace, I look pretty broadly at digital platforms and marketplaces. I mean, it's very hard to escape this, right? I mean, there's going to be a lot of interesting platforms, whatever it's called, Web3, so essentially blockchain, not all of them necessarily on blockchain, but like blockchain related or Web3 platforms and marketplaces. There's going to be a ton of them. So for example, I don't know if the audience is familiar with OpenSea. So OpenSea is the largest, it's basically the eBay of NFTs. It's the largest marketplace by far where people trade NFTs. I will bet, I mean, I'm willing to bet whatever people want that there's going to be, it just started, OpenSea, I think started in 2018 or something. They're doing really well. Very happy as an investor. I am certain that soon enough, there's going to be aggregators in there. There's just like, at this point, there's way too many collections. Some of them are scam. It's like, some of them, like, people don't know what they're doing. It's like, they're poorly marketed. Eventually, there's going to be, like, people will say, listen, like, there's an opportunity here to create interesting collections of NFTs. And, like, I'm sure there's going to be cool aggregation of NFTs for sure. So very similar trends, but yeah, take same logic, but now take it to Web3.
Great, thank you. And we've got a couple questions coming in from the audience, Andre. So one of them is Professor Hagiu mentioned Amazon copying popular concepts from the platform marketplace self-preferencing. Given the legislation being considered in the US on self-preferencing and the future review of Canada's Competition Act, what do you think regulators should be thinking about or learning from the roll-ups?
So I've written quite a bit on the topic of self-preferencing and the regulatory implications. So I have pretty strong views on that in the sense, like, I think regulators are a bit overly eager, or whatever, overly enthusiastic to punish the big platforms. So yes, it does sound bad on the face of it when you say, well, Amazon, the big bad Amazon is like imitating and, whatever, like small merchants. There's a few things to realize. So imitation by itself, I mean, unless there's a patent, which in most cases, like, these are whatever, tables, chairs, very commodity products, there's no real patent there. I don't think that's a problem. The real problem is basically when Amazon is using proprietary information that only they have due to marketplace sales in order to basically figure out which products so they use sales information that only they know, and sometimes the seller doesn't know, but which products are doing particularly well to figure out what to imitate. So I think it does make sense for regulators to focus not on imitation per se, but on this, like, let's call it illicit use of proprietary information. And there's a number of things you can do to regulate this, right? You can say, okay, you have like let's say the product teams within Amazon should not have access to the marketplace information. Or another way to take it is to say, if they do have access, then everybody should have access. So basically, Amazon should publish let's call it sales data for all the products, and this should be available via API. So any seller, you and I, like Josh and I, can like look at the sales data and basically say, okay, well, there's an opportunity, like given what's been trending over the past few months on Amazon, we can decide like this looks like a product that's becoming very popular. We should build a version of this product. So in that case, basically Amazon does not necessarily have an advantage. So that's number one. The number two aspect that regulators are, in this case, I think right to be worried about is the self-preferencing via algorithm, right? So it's this idea that, well, Amazon decides what to show in the buy box or what to put at the top. And, the idea should be like, they should not unfairly recommend their own product when there's a third-party seller that has a better / cheaper product, right? And I think there are ways you can go about this as well. You should be, presumably regulators could require Amazon to have an API that is auditable by outsiders, could be researchers, could be policymakers, and they could just like randomly test whether the algorithm. So I don't think it makes sense to basically ask them to reveal the algorithm. I think that's just going too far. But you can have this API, which is auditable, and I can go and basically test if the algorithm recommends truly the best product, or if the algorithm, unduly favors Amazon products. So I think there are solutions. I mean, my broad view is like, the reason I have these strong views, there was a lot of talk in the US and certainly other countries, which would be, they're proposing these idiotic policy interventions, which is like you should not allow Amazon or other companies to be both a marketplace and selling their own products. And that's crazy. Like there's lots of good things, lots of efficiencies that result from the fact that Amazon does both. So preventing that, I don't think that's a good idea. So that's a kind of like structural ban. I do think it makes sense to think about like how do you prevent self-preferencing, and like I mentioned, the use of proprietary data.
And we've got a lot of great questions coming in fast and furious. And so here's another one coming in from the chat. If you're representing the digital platform provider, how would you advise them on lowering the risk of disintermediation?
I wonder who wrote this. It's very funny because my co-author and I literally just posted on our websites last night a paper, which is exactly on this topic. It's called Marketplace Leakage. So you can just go on my website, you'll see it. We just posted it last night. And it's very funny because it's a paper that goes exactly through all these, through different strategies. Actually, one thing I can do, I have access to the chat, right?
You should, yeah.
So, again, I've written all these topics that I've talked about, so including this one, which I call, so disintermediation is one name, another name is leakage. We've written a number, so at least 2 or 3 posts on our Substack on it. And I'm just going to post a link here in the, should be everyone, right? Okay. Yeah, so I just posted the link in the chat to the Substack. If you go and, by the way, it's free. So you can go and subscribe and you can scroll through the content. We have at least 2 posts that talk exactly about this issue. It's like, if you're a marketplace, how do you think about disincentivizing or like reducing the risk of disintermediation? So I have lots of ideas about this because I advise a number of companies that have this problem, that suffer from this problem very acutely. So, very short answer is, I think the best way to go about it is you need to think about adding sufficient value beyond the initial match. So let's say there's a platform that makes it possible, that matches me with Julissa, right? For whatever, like for e-commerce purposes, right? And then we say, you know what, it's like, why do we keep paying this platform like 20%? Let's just take the transaction outside. So the way the marketplace should be thinking, well, it's like, what can we do? Like, what can we offer to the 2 parties, to Andrei and Julissa, in order for them to actually to motivate them to keep the transaction on the marketplace, even after they've already met, right? And they figured out that these transactions are worth having. So, whatever, insurance, or like just make the transaction a lot easier to conduct on the platform as opposed to having to conduct it somewhere else. But there's lots of other ideas, and I think we've written about it on our Substack.
Another question for you, Andre. So after the roll-up has time to play out, who buys the aggregator? In other industries, a strong brand player or a new market entrant will be the final buyer of an aggregator. Do you see any candidates who fit that profile?
So that's interesting. I wonder what examples you have in. So to me, it's like, no, by the way, the aggregator is a very big company. So Thrasio right now is a $10 billion company. I don't think they want to be bought. I mean, I think this is a company, it's like, if they haven't IPO'd yet, they will IPO soon. And a lot of these aggregators are going to become very large companies. So I think that's it. They're not going to be bought by someone. It's not like Pac-Man indefinitely. So I wonder what examples you have in mind in other industries where the aggregators are bought. I certainly don't. So it's an interesting question. So the analogy to big brands is a good one, because in some sense, what the aggregators are doing, you can think of the aggregators as basically the modern day version of, was it like Nestle, Unilever, and all, like Procter and Gamble, right? Which is kind of that's what these companies were doing. They have these like 1 million brands, and the whole point is like, we just have economies of scale. We can produce all these different things. We cross market and so on. It's kind of similar logic, except applied for marketplaces. And I think what's going to happen is like, yeah, you're going to have companies like big aggregators who are very good, like Thrasio and others. They are the modern day Unilevers and P&Gs and so on. And it's interesting because they will be probably specialized on different platforms. So there's going to be a Unilever for Amazon, or maybe there's a Unilever for Shopify or something like that.
I think in the response to that question about your point, he was saying in the US, radio stations, billboard companies, local TV affiliates, oil and gas drilling services. So I think those are some of the examples of aggregation that he had in mind, where they were eventually getting purchased by someone larger.
Right. I mean, I think at some point it has to stop, right? I mean, but I think, the brand point is this. I think, for a lot of, I don't think there's going to be multiple layers. I think one layer is enough. I mean, who knows, maybe there will be some consolidation between some aggregators, but for a lot of them, the game is like become publicly traded companies.
One last question on here. And again, if there's any more that anybody have, please throw them in there. I'll be happy to ask them to Andre. But thoughts on Epic versus Apple and other app store type marketplaces?
It's a broad question. So you have to be more specific.
I mean, unfortunately, I don't have enough here to go any deeper and guess.
No, we can. No, this is more like to the person who asked the question. If they want to specify, I mean, obviously we have some time. So, like, I mean, I have lots of thoughts. There's lots of interesting topics, lots of interesting aspects of Epic versus Apple, but it depends what you want to talk about.
How about the privacy element of it? Do you have any thoughts on how that comes in?
How so?
I know that they were making some claims about like the privacy rationale, like limiting the competitive impact of it. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
So I haven't thought very deeply about privacy. So I mean, there are other people that have written about this, and also like I'm not entirely sure. So I'm sure there might be some relationship between the privacy thing and Epic. I don't think it's the main issue in the Epic case is more about, is the fee, the 30% Apple fee, is it too much? Is it's that plus should they be allowed to force Epic to use their payment system, and things like that, which are kind of interesting.
Yeah, I'll keep waiting just in case if that individual wants to throw in a follow-up. But Andre, if there's one particular part of the Epic versus Apple that you would like to talk about that hits you the hardest, we're all ears at this point.
It hits me the hardest. Yeah, I mean, I think the part that's interesting to me is like, I was looking at it with my co-author, again, also because as angel investors, we see a lot of companies which are affected by this. So part of it, I think is, so up to now, basically Apple was allowed to say like there can be no other payment system and no other app store on the iPhone. And I think as a result of the Epic case, I mean, realistically, I think it will, like, very soon there will be competing app stores on the iPhone. I don't think Apple's going to be able to was it like to force them away, to essentially say like you can't have it. There will be competing app stores, and I wouldn't be surprised, for example, if Epic, I presume that's what they had in mind, like Epic is in a good position to say, listen, we want to have a specialized app store for games. That actually makes sense to me. I've actually seen this, like there was a Japanese company called Gri, which tried to do this like 10 years ago. I wrote a case study on this, and they got completely, so they were doing games for both iPhone and Android phones. And then the moment they said, and they had this idea is like, oh, we'll offer APIs to third-party game developers because we know how to do it. And also, like, we're going to create like a mini store for games to be discovered. And they got slammed by both Apple and Google. Said like, no, like obviously it's like no one's going to build an app store on top of our app stores, right? They didn't like that. I think things shift. So this kind of behavior, this is definitely feels like abusive, right? By Apple and Google. I think they can't do this anymore. Like, I think because of the lawsuits, I mean, the tide has turned, and there will be, I think there will be interesting, there will be companies that create, potentially like competing app stores on the iPhone and on Androids. So I've seen certain startups, I've invested in some, they're kind of going in that direction. They're creating technologies. They're also like cross-platform, so between iOS and Android. And I think, yeah, it opens up more interesting opportunities for developers.
Well, I think that's an exciting place to finish off. And with that, Andrei, I'd just like to say thank you so much for joining us today, and everybody in attendance, thank you for listening along. Really cool, really riveting stuff. I feel like I'm on the cutting edge right now after listening to you. So thank you very much for giving us that opportunity and for your time.
No, that was really fun. Thank you for having me. And yeah, it was a pleasure. If people, again, I posted the platform chronicles. I think that's probably the easiest way to get a sense of what I'm working on. But if you find it interesting, come talk more, feel free to connect with me.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone. And Andrei, hopefully we'll have a chance to collaborate again in the future.